Is it hard for you to see him be emotionally available to somebody else?
Yeah. Yep.
Is that like a dagger in your heart?
It's like a knife in my kidney.
The first sound you notice is the tremor of your own breath. Because somewhere between the fluorescent buzz overhead and the hush that drives the gallery to the edges of their seats, a truth you have carried for years finally begins to stir. And it hits you with a visceral certainty that the next 10 minutes might define a decade. The doors swing wide with a soft hydraulic sigh, and the whole room the oak benches. The varnished rail, the microphones standing like little black sentry seams, to lean forward as though even timber and metal understand hunger when it's dressed as justice. Christine crosses the threshold first, her chin lifted not like a challenge but like a hymn survived. The measured cadence of her steps as deliberate as a drumline. She has taught herself to march too in the long winter when she learnt to stop, apologizing for existing, and behind her Janelle glides with the taut, elemental poise of a woman who has learnt to make spreadsheets of feelings and budgets of breath. Jaw tight as if another question were a muscle clenched. Meri loiters at the doorway, a heartbeat too long, skittering across faces and cameras and the black square of the clock. The weight of old ghosts jangling in her handbag with the compulsion to run, yet she walks in anyway because at some point the rope stops being a tether and becomes a noose, and you either step forward or you dangle. The room inhales again as the hinges protest a second time, and Robyn arrives attached to Kody's arm as though she fears physics might discard her without the tether of him. Her elegance a glaze painted fast over hairline fractures, while he plays king, smoothing a cufflink as though his reflection in that fisheye oval might fix the bead of sweat that chooses defiance at his temple flashes pop. Nibs scratch. The blandly merciless lights cast their antiseptic sheen upon a tableau that once called itself Unity and now looks very much like a staged photograph put into vinegar. The judge whose face you couldn't place on any coffee mug, but whose reserve is a kind of authority. Older than the room ascends, robe swallowing light. Gavel descending with a pop that reverberates in the soft tissue of everyone's chest. And when the bailiff's baritone announces the session, the air itself tightens like a drumhead. This is not criminal, not yet. He says with a cadence so careful, you hear the geometry in his syllables. And yet the words sting. Mismanagement of family assets. Betrayal of trust, emotional abuse, a contested will-o'-will murmurs feather through the gallery because wills belong to endings and endings belong to funerals. And funerals belong to the quiet rooms of breath held between sobs. And yet here we are in public, tallying the estate of something that called itself a covenant. And at that word, Christine shifts, a hairline motion of shirt cuff and spine. And when she looks up, you see not the damp glitter of grievance, but that colder, steadier luminance of hurt that has learnt the mathematics of patience. The financial advisor climbs to the stand like a person who knows that numbers do not scream, but they do accumulate until they weigh the soul to the gram. A wiry man with a manila folder that has grown dense with facts, and he reads them in that accountant timber that takes some seconds to register as lethal dates, mounts, vendors, locations, the occasional rhythm as slow as a metronome at the end of the world, Kody's name recurring. Robyn's recurring, Christine's and Janelle's, barely flickering in the ledger like winter sun, and Meri once 3 years ago. Are the transfers unauthorized? The judge asks, eyebrows composing a quiet indictment. And the advisor nods because the word yes seldom weighs as much as it does when it means you are draining a shared future. With a straw hidden behind a smile, the phrase freeze request lands like a cold coin on the courtroom floor. Someone knew. Someone ran to the grown-ups, someone yanked the emergency brake hand. That's when Christine rises, the silk of her blouse catching light in a way that makes you think of a woman stepping out from behind a curtain she did not hang. And she says she never wanted this here because the hope had been that privacy might grow a conscience. But nobody listened. And in the curved hush of the room, You hear the years of that word, nobody curdled into the amber of a voice that has decided to become evidence. She did not come to accuse, she came armored to prove. And she unfurls the paper like a magician who hates tricks. A transfer of over $100,000 done in the week she was told they couldn't afford Christmas presents. The week a new SUV slid into a driveway like a gleaming apology written to someone else's reflection. Robyn whitens as if the blood itself has chosen to go into hiding. Kody smirks with the baritone of a man who thinks tone can lawyer a fact into a different shape. But the judge's gavel cuts his noise cleanly, and there is a brief, almost holy silence in which truth stops being a theory and becomes a weight in the room, a boulder rolled to the threshold that will not go back uphill. "We preached unity," Christine says, and there's a flicker then, that dangerous little light that appears when a mantra is interrogated long enough to reveal its teeth, because unity without transparency is merely control in its Sunday suit. The judge thanks her. The gallery exhales in that awkward robotic ripple that happens when a crowd has been holding one breath for a page and a half. And the court sets its rhythm toward tomorrow with Janelle's testimony named like a promised storm, yet as if time develops a taste for irony. Robyn bolts to her feet with a tremor in her voice that sounds like a violin string stretched to breaking, and the judge denies the impulse with a palm that says, "Later. Later," and the session dissolves into corridors wet with camera lights and questions shaped like knives. While in the center of that dispersal, Kody sits leaned forward like a man watching. A flood collapsed the last plank of a bridge he once boasted was unsinkable. Night cracks and rearranges itself into morning with the chemistry of rooms where people do not sleep well. And when the same chairs, rail, microphones, and humidity reform, the energy is heavier, not loud but granular. Like the way ash in the air makes sunlight appear as something you can rub between fingers. Christine in navy arrives first, face like a sealed letter, not concealing blankness, but containing contents for somebody who has a right to know. Kody arrives with the kinetic twitch of a man who cannot locate his old stage within the new acoustics. Robyn beside him with a binder clutched like a rib that might fall out if she loosens. When the proceedings open, the gavel is no longer an event, but a punctuation. And yet the pause, after it the vacuum of all that is about to be said, demands everyone's lungs redeclare loyalty to oxygen. Christine swears in with the deliberation of someone who understands the weight of oaths and the cost of living with them. She begins with love and with what love was not merely because hard stories require tenderness or they develop a brittle shell, but because the court needs to know the architecture of the house before it can understand how the beams failed. And her voice finds that scalpel edge, precise, unshowy, the early compromises. The hunger that felt holy because it was shared, the way they taught one another and borrowed hope like sugar. Then the inflection point that refuses to become euphemism. After Robyn joined, she says, and the room does not hiss because the room is doing maths. She lays down figures like a dealer who wants you to see every card. 63,000 earmarked. For home repairs that winter, none spent on the homes that actually smelled of their children. And in the very month her daughter faced a surgeon's, light the joint purse, apparently too starved to pay out of pocket while a ring. Custom and Glorious appeared with a price that could have funded kindness for a season. When the screenshot slides across to become evidence, Robyn's initials nest in the corner of a private banking program. Neat letters that suddenly look like they were forged from borrowed breath. Short-term holding account, Kody had called it, and that phrase now sounds like the kind of trick you play on a cat with a laser pointer red dot. Go fetch while the hand doing the pointing is busy unscrewing the jar where all the sugar lives. What you notice more than the numbers? More than the jewelry receipts and the trips salted into months that wore the aesthetic of modesty, is the structure of it. The power to approve, the authority to rename silence as virtue. The architecture of a family machine that taught gratitude as a method of control. The checks to some homes arriving on time as though they alone understood gravity, while others had to audition for basic dignity. Christine's folder opens like a lung. She produces a notarized codicil discovered by accident. The paper yellowed in the way that suggests truth sometimes needs to be old to be believed. A clause clear as winter air. Any wife proven to have transferred money on her own without written approval from all loses her portion of the estate. And the words do not merely land, they rearrange chairs in people's minds. The freeze request is formally sought. The judge steeples his fingers, his gaze a ledger of its own. And as he announces recess to consider the motion, the room doesn't move. All the bones in all the bodies temporarily devoted to gravity. When they break, when they flow into corridors and car parks and low muttered headlines, a new geometry has formed, one in which Christine isn't a villain or a saint, but an archivist of promises. The quiet fury of proof, turning shame into a scaffolding sturdy enough to climb out of a hole. The second session on the second day begins in a room that feels cooler, though the thermostat hasn't altered. That strange psychosomatic weather that occurs when proximity to truth knocks a few degrees off the air. Janelle crosses to the stand like an equation solved over years, its step a digit. Each breath, a formula, her oath clean, her sit deliberate. And her first words as uncluttered as a scalpel on a tray. She didn't plan to testify, not because she lacked story, but because belief is expensive when the thing you must believe about those you loved is a kind of arithmetic, where numbers don't debate. The bank statements, she says. Missing figures that do not sound like much at first. 5,000. 3,800 until they begin to stack like brick upon brick. 11,000, a sequence pressed into a span of months that resembled a house being quietly dismantled from the back. Drywall first. When she says she rang the bank herself, a murmur flutters because we recognize the moment a person stops outsourcing their sanity. The bank described internal transfers from someone with full access to signatories Kody and Robyn and Janelle's. Hands do not shake as she holds up the paper that revealed this like a late dawn. The camera screen coughs to life at her click. A foyer filmed in indifferent grayscale. A man entering late, a woman greeting, a signature scrawled where no group had looked together. A pen biting paper where a rule once stood. No contracts without. The circle, no commitments without the plural mind. Robyn erupts birthday card. But the court is not a place where exclamation marks can alter a transaction log. And the judge's gavel cages the shout, ribs it in silence. The $27,000 transfer 3 days later has the neat cause and effect flourish of a badly written novel. Except this isn't fiction, and the punchline is a canceled family holiday draped in the language of frugality. What wrecks Janelle isn't pounds. It's the smear, paranoid, dramatic, ungrateful, the sorts of words that leave smudges on the mirror you have to scrub for months after you escape the house. She produces text, those fatal little telegrams of our century, once it's all in your name. Don't worry, Janelle never reads the fine print. And you can feel the oxygen in the room tilt towards Christine as if all the women you have ever known, their insistences, their lists, their carefulness have gathered to witness those words being said out loud where consequences can hear them. The room uncoils, stunned and electric, until the tension snaps and everyone's tongues fly loose at once. Robyn surges up. A flare of defense and fear. Kody stands too, but the chorus of Christine, Janelle, Meri each adding the line, they, heard in private about not trusting the others, makes a new kind of music. Not melody, but revelation. The way you realize a chorus has always been a flag if you look at it from above. All those voices shaped like a map. The judge recesses them because the room no longer holds air so much as sparks. And as people start to stand, the courier appears with a sealed folder for the judge's eyes only. A cinematic cliche made suddenly real by the way the judge's jaw sets when he reads the first line. Whatever sits in that slim sheaf breeds a hush that will carry us into the next room, the next hour, the next testimony. Meri's voice, coaxed by a silence that recognizes her as a hinge upon which the door must turn, says it isn't over. And every face rotates towards the person who learned early how to move softly around a house to keep it from topple, who received cupcakes where her name once lived on a ledger, who watched herself be included only as absence. Recess ends, the judge returns, and Meri walks to the stand like a woman who has negotiated with fire enough times to know when to stop paying. And when she swears and begins, she does not scatter, she does not sway. She lays out the small cruelties, and the large ones in a chain so simple it hurts kitchen whispers not meant for her ears. The little administrative vanishings that rebrand a person as dust. The visit with confectionery that sweetened exile. The letter removing her from a secondary trust with a signature that is not hers. And when she lays the two signatures side by side on the screen, the room gasps, not because the differences scream, but because the resemblance is almost careful. And in that care, you hear intent. She keeps her voice low through the worst, as if protecting the marble of the room from fracture. And when she reads the voice memo transcript up, rant that turned her into a chore to be completed rather than a covenant to be honored, the judges face tightens, and the gallery realizes that sometimes the kindest mercy in a story like this is paperwork. She sits, spent but lifted, and the judge, whose patience has been an instrument more than a virtue, announces a further recess before cross-examination. At which point, a man in a gray suit rolls in a box labeled with the awful blandness of audit files, introduces himself as a forensic accountant, and tells the court without drama that he was retained to investigate RNC holdings and shell accounts 2 years ago. That the box is dense with transactions that hate daylight. That a second name appears as cosigner, and when the judge reads it, he swallows whatever word tried to escape. The order pins everyone to the county like butterflies through vellum. And as the day dissolves into evening, the rumor of that name scuttles around the edges of consciousness. Because sometimes the anticipation of a revelation is almost as lethal as the revelation itself. Dawn again, colder, quicker. And the room adjusts the way bodies do when grief has taught them a new posture. And the accountant begins to thread numbers into a narrative. Cayman roots, Wyoming shells, more than 312,000. In 14 months, signatures nested beside signatures. The digital logs like constellations you never noticed until someone drew the lines between stars. The name, when it emerges, sucks the breath from the benches. Gwen and Christine breaks. The neatness of the row with a cry that shatters polite acoustics because it isn't the figure that knifes her. It is the trespass into her child's name. A child conscripted without informed consent into a ritual performed in a tiny room where a father coaxed a voice to read, calling it safety while he turned her mouth into a stamp. And suddenly the trial reorganizes itself around a new axis. This isn't just misappropriation with genteel vocabulary. This is the conversion of daughters into armor. More slides. Aurora's name caught in the jaws of a deed sale that migrates profit into Robyn's accounts like a trained pigeon. And Robyn collapses with a sound like a curtain falling, insisting intent wasn't malice. And the court nods coolly, because intent without consent is simply a softer adjective for harm. The day ends before the judgment, because narratives like this must be simmered by law. And a therapist arrives with folders filled with deduno and please listen. A decade of notes so quiet they seem designed to be read under blankets. And yet here they are, case notes becoming testimony. Fear under devotion. Punishments disguised as boundaries. The monosyllables children said to self-protect. And the judge's face does a private arithmetic and arrives at the only sum it can: coercion. And still there is one more twist arriving like a letter misdelivered at midnight. An affidavit from an assistant whose name matters too much to be merely ink. McKelty, who writes that she renamed and deleted at their request because tax season sounded like a place where grown-ups know what to do. Who erased a folder called Joint Legacy, which turns out to be the museum where fair distribution and original promises caught their breath. And you look at the women in the front row, how They hold their bodies. How they have started to inhabit silence differently. You understand that whatever the judge eventually says will matter. Will shape the scaffolding on which they rebuild. But that something else has already happened. The camera has left. The man who insisted on his angles and now kneels to the women who survived them. The judge says closing arguments tomorrow, damages and impact statements now. And in the measured procession of those final testimonies, day slips its skin and becomes a reckoning. And in the coil of everything said and everything discovered, the gavel lifts, the county order glints, and the story holds the last intake of breath before the endgame begins. Before verdicts and freezes and trustees and the long, slow work of unspooling control from the weave of a life lived in a costume, called unity. And as the benches empty for the final time this side of judgment, the truth that has sat uninvited at all their meals at last pushes out its chair and takes the head of the table, waiting for the gavel tomorrow to catch up with what the room already knows. You feel the moment snagged like a thread on a nail, one small catch that promises to unspool everything because the hush that greets the morning has a different temperature today. Not cool or ceremonial, but charged, like the air before a storm. When even birds grow thoughtful. The judge's gavel settles the room with a sound that feels less like wood on wood and more like a key turning in a long-locked door. And Janelle rises again, not reluctant this time, not merely dutiful, but resolute, her palms flat on the rail as if pressing down on the tremor of old years, so it won't show. Voice steady as a metronome, set to courage as she resumes the tight stitchwork of her testimony. Guiding the court back through ledgers and late nights and that soft, humiliating choreography of doubt where you second-guess your eyes because someone you love has learned to speak with the confidence of a dictionary. She traces lines across printouts that look dull until they bloom into a pattern pounds draining at holidays. During family trips. In weekends, masked as wellness retreats on. When she points to the dates, you see the choreography of it. Generosity. Announced in public while private accounts siphoned in silence. Apology phrases offered with the grace of a bouquet while the root system beneath the whole garden was quietly being cut. And through it all, the drip-drip erosion of a rule they once agreed meant safety, no contracts without the circle, which now lies on the floor like shattered crockery no one dares sweep. The security clip flares again, pin drop silence. That gray hallway with the late-night signature like a moth pressed to glass. And though Robyn whispers it was a birthday card, the timing is a wolf that refuses to wear lamb's clothing. 27,000 move days later to cover a bill everyone else had been taught to fear like a storm cloud. And across the aisle, Kody stares at a scuff on the floor with that tight, furious stillness of a man learning that the pose of command can't shout down arithmetic. The texts land with the blunt intimacy of a slammed door. Once it's all in your name, you won't need their approval, and Janelle doesn't gloat, doesn't even raise her voice. She simply lets the words sit where justice can see them, then lowers her eyes in that small human pause that says, "This is the part where it hurts. It's the part I don't want to read, but must." When she steps down, the room exhales a collective wrecked breath, and for a heartbeat, it seems as if sound itself has gone shy of returning. Until Meri stands in that quiet with the gravity of someone who has ferried grief across a long river, swears in with a chin that no longer trembles and begins to lay out her small, sharp pieces, cupcakes and kindness weaponized into nudges. The way her name slid off a mailing list like frost off a leaf. The letter that arrived with a signature she didn't write, and a future she hadn't consented to each sentence, and unspooling each document a lantern. She speaks of the conversation she overheard in the kitchen, not to weaponize memory, but to anchor it. And her calm is worse for Kody than anger would be because it denies him the friction he knows how to use. The forged signature appears on the screen, side by side with the real, and the awful craft of it becomes the court's first true portrait of intent. The pressure, the slope, the mimicry that tells you this wasn't an accident, but an art someone hoped would pass in the dim light of fatigue. Robyn protests that she never signed anything in Meri's hand, and the judge's gavel refuses performance, corralling the noise back into the matter at hand. And when Meri concludes, "I'm not here to punish. I'm here to stop being punished," the gallery looks briefly like a church. All those faces arranged around an idea bigger than any one of them. The idea that a quiet person can point to the spot where a story forked and say, "There." The Courier's sealed folder lands like a coin in an old well. Small noise. Enormous consequence, and recess tastes metallic on the tongue. People speak in the brittle shorthand of shock. Reporters sprout theories like bracken after rain. Ooh. And yet the deeper shift is happening in the front row. Christine's hand on Janelle's. Meri's shoulder lifted half an inch higher, as if a weight just rolled off. Three women finding a geometry that no longer requires permission. The afternoon returns with a new player, a forensic accountant, whose gray suit is the color of understatement. On a box that looks too modest to contain the gravity it holds. He doesn't posture. K aligns, calibrates, uncaps the slow drip of numbers into story. Cayman wires and Wyoming shells. The opacity of Delaware. The choreography of transfers too neat to be naive. 312,000 in 14 months, pulling like tide from the same shared shoreline. They were taught to protect. The digital signature audit blossoms on the screen, rows of approvals that read like a duet. And when he says there is a second co-signer, the room finds a single heartbeat. Everyone listening with the full surface of their skin. "Gwen," he says. And the sound that tears out of Christine isn't theatrical. There's no room in it for performance. It is the animal note a mother makes when the horizon suddenly tilts to show her child in the crosshairs. The video is small and cruel. A tiny room, awkward light. A fidgeting girl asked to read words she doesn't understand. A father's voice soothing the ritual with the promise of protection. The way some men consecrate harm with the language of safety, and you feel the courtroom take a step back all at once, as if contact burns. Robyn folds in on herself at the next slide. Doras and deeds and tidy profits migrating into accounts with her name. Tax protection like a gauze put over a wound someone else must bleed for. And the judge's face turns into the kind of stillness that makes space for rage without letting it run the show. He instructs that the children's names are to be scrubbed from the architecture of those companies, that the properties revert to the estate, that the audit continues beyond the borders of his bench, and though legal consequence is a machine that can be slow to bite. The click of its teeth is audible. As the day wins, therapist arrives with a stack of notes that look gentle and prove devastating. Years of sessions distilled into sentences that confirm what the women learned in their bodies. Questioning was punished. Dissent got renamed. As disloyalty, affection rationed like petrol in a war. Children taught the pieties of silence in exchange for warmth. She says the word coercion in her professional voice, and the word does what truth does when it is finally given the right name. It stops hiding. By now, Kody looks less like a ruler and more like a man caught in a web of his own weaving. Eyes rimmed with red, shoulders compacted by the dawning comprehension that the story doesn't obey him anymore. While Robyn's mascara has mapped little deltas under her eyes, and she holds her tissues like rosary beads for a faith that has lost its hymnal. The affidavit that drops next is a match in a room full of Tinder McKelty's statement in clean, sad prose about renaming folders and deleting trails at their instruction. The gasp rising like heat when the phrase joint legacy is read out, and everyone realizes it was not only money that vanished, but also the minute architecture of fairness. The signatures that once promised equal distribution archived into oblivion so the future could be rewritten without witnesses. In the impact statements that follow, language becomes a weapon you're allowed to wield without guilt. Christine speaks of holy hunger and the ache of realizing it had been used as camouflage. Janelle of the way prudence was turned into a lever to pry her out of decisions, Meri of being given cupcakes where honesty belonged. When Robyn tries to say she lied to survive, Meri's soft but unyielding answers that survival without truth is simply a prettier name for harm. And then the courtroom resets itself to hear from the man who taught it the shape of its orbit. Kody summoned to the stand, oath spoken with the clipped impatience of someone who still thinks a confident posture can confuse a compass. And questioned not on his charm but on his choices. Each answer pulls a thread from the mythar, and C as risk management never disclosed. Transfers qualified rather than authorized. Emotional stewardship weaponized into the threat of exclusion when finances were questioned, and there is a moment, quiet and ugly, when he laughs at the word dead weight and then tries to backpedal it as a flash of anger, and the court, having just been shown what anger can do, does not indulge. The forged signature is placed beside his driving record scrawl, the pen pressure and slant unromantically similar. And when he says, "If you can prove it, arrest me," the lawyer reminds him this isn't a criminal trial yet. Something skitters across Kody's face that looks for the first time like fear rather than fury. The surprise witness returns, David Harris. With his neat pages and inexorable tone-confirming shell accounts that spit up not only money, but a mirror. And when the judge orders that no one leave the county pending review, Robyn clutches Kody's sleeve without looking up, and Kody doesn't take the hand. Because men who crafted obedience sometimes don't know what to do when a hand asks for kindness instead. Evening floods the high windows with that melancholy light that makes even dust look like meaning. And when court adjourns, you step into a corridor thrumming with cameras and commentary. But you notice something quieter threaded beneath. Christine's arm barely brushing Janelle's. Meri's small, fierce nod. 3 hearts beating in a tempo that no longer requires a fourth to set it. The night finds the city unremarkable. Unremarkable. The way cities often are in the hours when lives tilt, but inside hotel rooms and rented flats, the insomnia is busy. Rearranging furniture and minds, and dawn arrives pale and unslept. The benches filling early as if people believe proximity might catch them an answer. The judge speaks of federal letters and boundaries of jurisdiction, of asset freezes and trustees, of the children's names to be laundered out of documents where they never should have appeared, of professional recommendations for counseling because law can redraw lines, but cannot refill a cup that was rinsed out daily for years. He speaks to the moral seam of it, that a man built a pulpit and then used it to lower the ceiling over the people who knelt beneath. That unity without honesty is simply a choreography of deference, and that the cost of silence is paid most dearly by the ones who learned it young. And still, for all the necessary steel of orders, the most important architecture might be happening behind the words. Christine's posture, almost imperceptibly looser. Janelle's gaze level rather than searching. Meri's hands no longer nodding at the wrist, as if each has found a door inside herself that opens into weather and can be left ajar. The reporters will file headlines that mention shell companies and will clauses and a father's name, whispered too often into rooms that didn't deserve it. But you will remember other things. The faint electric sting in the air when a truth is finally spoken in a place where it can be believed. The ritual way a woman straightens her blouse before she says something that might change the rest of her life. The precise, brutal mercy of paperwork. And above all, the moment when the women stopped addressing an audience and started addressing each other. An axis tilt you could feel in your bones. By the time the gavel falls on the day's edge, you can taste the verdict, even if the words haven't been read yet, because the story has already rearranged its furniture. The man at the center has been moved to the periphery. The camera turns to the people who learned that survival can be dignified. And the next breath the room takes is one you recognize from every ending that mattered. It is the sound of something breaking and something being born in the same beat. The music of a future stepping into its shoes. And so, as chairs scrape and the bailiff's voice unlaces the last knot of ceremony, you brace for the last bend in the road. The judgment and the reckonings, stitched to it knowing that when part 3 begins, the light will be different. Not kinder perhaps, but honest. And honesty is the only torch that burns without smoke. It begins not with thunder, but with that peculiar quiet that often precedes catastrophe. A stillness that doesn't soothe but prickles, like the moment when a storm has gathered its full intent behind the hills, yet has not chosen where to break. And in this tension, Meri Brown rises before her name is even called. A woman so long accustomed to moving as though apologizing for the space she occupied, now carrying herself with the calm defiance of someone who has walked through fire and finally realized the flames were not her shame to bear but her proof of survival. And when she places her hand upon the Bible, her voice does not quiver, because what shakes is not her now but the court itself. The gallery, the reporters, even the accused, all suddenly aware that the one they thought the quietest has become the storm's eye. She begins slowly, saying she never wanted to talk because she knew if she did, nothing would ever be the same. And her words slice through the stale air like a bow across strings, resonant and unavoidable. Each confession a stone dropping into the still water of the courtroom, how she overheard Kody and Robyn in the kitchen. Her name spoken like an inconvenience to be managed away. Robyn's laugh, not of kindness, but of collusion. The soft coo of exclusion begun with cupcakes at her table. The gradual erasure from emails and accounts until she existed only as a rumor of her former place. And then the letter, cold and formal, that informed her she was gone without warning. A signature forged in a hand meant to mimic her own but carrying the unmistakable pressure of another's will. She lays it all bare: the forgeries, the emails, the visits. The transcripts of voice memos where Kody's voice ranted about closing her out like one disposes of old furniture. And the court doesn't breathe because forgeries can be measured in strokes and slants. But betrayal measured in silence is the more devastating ledger. And in the space between her testimony and her tears, Meri grows from ghost to witness to thunder, forcing Robyn's trembling denials into the light and Kody's silence into a kind of confession no denial could mask. When she steps down at last, lighter though trembling, the court has shifted again, and it is into this fragile silence that Kody himself is called to the stand. The man around whom the mythology of unity had been spun, now forced to sit in the hard square of truth, oath muttered like a chore, arms crossed as if his body might barricade him against evidence. But evidence is merciless. The lawyer lays before him the logs of RNC holdings, the checks that became spa treatments, the shell accounts, the jewelry, the forged signatures matched against his hand at the DMV. And the courtroom watches as his confidence cracks hairline by hairline, his smirk disintegrating into clenched fists, his volume rising into outbursts. The judge cuts down with stern gavel strikes, until finally the lawyer asks the simplest, sharpest question of all: does he regret the way he managed his family? And his answer, bitter and brittle: I regret ever thinking it would work, falls into the chamber like a self-dug grave. In that moment, the myth collapses, not with the roar of a building imploding, but with the dull, seismic sigh of a roof caving under its own neglected beams. And even Robyn's desperate attempts to defend him falter as the texts, the video, the accounts all line up like soldiers in testimony against the empire they thought unassailable. And just when you imagine the crescendo has been reached, the doors open and the forensic accountant returns with his unassuming gray suit and that terrible, implacable box of secrets. Rolling it forward like a coffin of paper, its subpoena sticker bright as a warning flare, and inside it more transactions, more offshore routes, but worst of all, a second name revealed through blockchain unraveling: daughters. Gwen, dragged into signatures she never understood. Video of her reading lines coaxed by her father's voice under the guise of ritual, her innocence conscripted into financial armor. And the courtroom doesn't gasp this time so much as recoil. everybody leaning back as though the very air had turned radioactive. For here, the betrayal spills beyond marriage and into bloodline, into the exploitation of children to paper over adult greed. And Christine's cry, half horror, half maternal fury, burns through the hall like a flare. The last pretense of piety peeled away to reveal something raw and far more profane. Robyn's collapse follows, mascara rivers streaking down her cheeks. Her protests about tax protection withering under the accountant's calm recital that her daughter's name too was tethered to deeds and flips. Profits fed back into accounts that wore the family's initials like a mask. And by the time the judge calls an emergency adjournment, the courtroom is less a chamber of law than a mausoleum of illusions. It silenced the silence of ruins after fire, the quiet that knows rebuilding will never bring back what was burned. And as the crowd files out in scattered shock, reporters swarming with questions that suddenly feel obscene. The brown women sit together for the first time in months, not touching, not speaking, but breathing in sync. And in that synchrony, you sense the axis has shifted forever, that no matter what verdict tomorrow brings, the story has already begun to write itself without the man who thought he owned its pen. It begins with a kind of silence that feels alive, a hush so deep it seems the walls themselves are holding their breath. For the final day dawns heavy, the benches crammed before the doors even open. Every reporter, every spectator, every cousin and critic and stranger drawn by the magnetism of reckoning. All of them sensing that what unfolds today will not merely be the conclusion of a case, but the unmasking of a legacy. And when the bailiff calls order and the gavel strikes, it no longer sounds like wood at all, but like time itself stamping its seal. The end of an era written in the very grain of the room. Kody sits slumped, his arrogance evaporated into hollow-eyed exhaustion. Robyn beside him with her face streaked from nights of tears that could not cleanse her conscience, while Christine, Janelle, and Meri sit together, not triumphant, but steady. Their silence that of survivors who have carried the storm and now await the sky's decision. And into this silence, the forensic accountant's box is reopened. Documents projected like gravestones on the wall, transactions, deeds, offshore shells, all whispering the same unrelenting chorus of betrayal. Until the name of a daughter glows again across the screen and the gallery stiffens. Gwen's face in the grainy video, fidgeting under her father's coaxing voice. Aurora's name stamped on deeds she never signed. Innocence turned into ink. And the judge's jaw tightens as he declares the children's names scrubbed. Their identities restored to innocence. Their exploitation a matter for investigators beyond this court, and still the parade of revelations marches on. McKelty's affidavit admitted. Her words plain and devastating as she confesses how she renamed and erased files at Kody and Robyn's bidding. How the folder titled Joint Legacy, The Covenant of Equality, was deleted like it never existed. And the wives weep not because they are shocked, but because hearing it named is like standing at the grave of something you had buried quietly years ago, now forced to acknowledge its death aloud. Impact statements follow, each woman standing not as accuser but as archivist of her pain. Christine, speaking of sacred hunger turned into camouflage, of nights of loneliness repaid with lies. Janelle, speaking of sacrifices repaid with gaslighting, of prudence twisted into chains. Meri, speaking of cupcakes in place of truth, of silence demanded as her tax for belonging, and the gallery leans forward as if the very air must carry these words out into the world. And then Robyn speaks, her voice a shredded thing, confessing she lied to survive, insisting she wanted peace, and Meri's whisper slices through. Survival without truth is harm. And even Robyn folds under the weight of that plain sentence. At last, Kody is given his final word, but the charisma is gone, the bravado dissolved. And what comes out is thin. Defeated, he says he never meant to hurt anyone. He thought only he could hold it all together, and the judge cuts him short with, A phrase that lands like a gavel itself, and yet you were the one wielding the hammer. And Kody lowers his eyes because there is nothing left to say. The court breaks for deliberation, and when it returns, the room has the stillness of a graveyard. Every body upright, every throat dry. As the judge reads, all assets under RNC Holdings frozen. Ownership stripped from Kody and Robyn, transferred. To a neutral trustee, distribution restored to Christine, Janelle, and Meri as equal beneficiaries. Robyn barred from claim until audit complete. Kody disbarred as executor of the family trust. Forbidden from touching any estate papers, his misappropriation. Established by evidence and testimony alike, his manipulation declared a breach of duty both legal and moral. And though the judge admits the law cannot codify emotional abandonment, he names it nonetheless as harm. It scars deeper than wealth lost. And he says aloud the truth. The gallery has long whispered that this was not a family. It was a hierarchy, and it is undone now. Robyn weeps into her palms, murmuring, "I didn't mean to." And the judge tells her intention does not erase impact. While Christine closes her eyes as though setting down a burden older than her own face, Janelle exhales like someone surfacing. From years underwater, Meri grips her notebook like a relic of her survival. And Kody stares forward at nothing. A hollow man where once a myth strutted. Outside, the reporters swarm, but inside, the women approach one another without words. Christine meeting Janelle's gaze, Meri rising to meet them. Three voices, now one chorus of survival. Not needing Kody's orbit or Robyn's permission, only themselves. The judge slams his gavel one final time, court adjourned. But the sound that follows is not noise or chaos. It is a collective exhale, raw and holy. The release of years of silence finally given its verdict. And in that moment, the women are not victims, but survivors. Their story not defined by the man who once controlled the lens, but by their own voices rising like fire from ash. And though federal investigators wait in the wings, though headlines explode, though the war may continue in courts and audits and inquiries, the battle here is over, and the ending belongs not to Kody's downfall, but to Christine, Janelle, and Meri walking out side by side into the sunlight, their heads unbowed, their silence broken forever. And you know, watching them go, that the true verdict was not the freezing of accounts or the despairing of a patriarch, but the restoration of dignity, of voice, of truth. And that is the ending the gavel could never deny.